Welcome to Executive Session from Directors and Boards.
Boards do spend an enormous amount of time discussing succession, but I sometimes feel like it is through an old lens, the same sort of playbook.
Hello, and welcome to Executive Session, the official podcast of Directors and Boards. I'm Bill Hayes, Editor-in-Chief of Directors and Boards. We just heard from Suzan Morno-Wade, Director and Compensation Committee Chair of Latham Pool Products Inc, on the board CEO-CHRO relationship. In this episode of Executive Session, we'll also explore the quarterly board meeting with Amy Shenkan and right-sizing the board with Jeffery Perry. Boards often talk about who sits in the room, but is that really the point? Today, we're asking a tougher question, not how many seats you have, but what capabilities you actually need. My first guest, Jeffery Perry, Director of Fortune Brands Innovations and MasterBrand Inc, argues that oversized, expertise-heavy boards can quietly become slower, more bureaucratic, and less equipped for what's coming, from AI to cyber threats and geopolitical shocks. So what does a board built for 5 years from now actually look like? And how do you know when yours has crossed the line from healthy diversity of thought to dead weight? Jeffery, many boards spend considerable time discussing board composition, but you argue that composition is ultimately more important than size. What are the most common mistakes boards make when they focus on filling seats instead of building the capabilities the company will need 5 years from now?
Yeah, one of the things that I see really fundamentally get back to the fact that it's important to have a skills matrix that most boards benefit from using. So with that as a backdrop, one of the things that I've seen related to just filling seats come down to really fundamentally replacing board seats with like for like. Say, for example, someone leaves the board that has a certain profile, and then the desire is to fill that same profile going forward. While that may be okay, that may not be the skill that is actually needed going forward. So one mistake is just filling like for like, as opposed to really just taking a step back and thinking about what's actually needed at that particular point in time. Another mistake that people make is making board decisions when it's based on urgency. So let's say, for example, there is an activist challenge or some other urgent situation where a board seat needs to be filled very quickly, and often there's just a focus on responding to a certain challenge or request, as opposed to, again, proactively thinking about what are the skills that are needed in the future in terms of filling that seat going forward. Another mistake that that's often made is what I call the resume trap. And that's when a seat is filled basically just based on the prestige of a person coming onto the board or the notoriety of someone coming onto the board, without necessarily thinking about, again, the skills that are needed going forward. Now, that person may have the skills, but sometimes it gets trumped by the prestige or the status of that particular director. And the final mistake that I see is something that I would call the relationship trap. Now, we know that a lot of board seats are filled through networks, and that's fine. And only certain board seats are filled through executive search. But when board seats are filled primarily from a relationship perspective, it's easy to overlook what are the actual skill sets that are needed. And let's, as opposed to that, just thinking more about the relationships that are being fulfilled in terms of filling those seats. So those are like 4 areas that I see as common mistakes, but they all get exposed when you are overlooking the fundamental skills matrix that I think create significant value from a board governance perspective.
You suggest that many boards continue to over-index on traditional expertise while under-indexing on disruptive technologies and emerging risks. As AI and cybersecurity reshape the business landscape, what experiences or perspectives do you believe boards most urgently need to add today?
Yeah, well, definitely it's hard to generalize, and it depends on the industry, and it depends on the board, and it depends on the circumstance. But in general, I would say it is important for most companies to have that digital competency on their boards. Certainly from an AI perspective, that's really important, as well as skills that are focused on disruption and change and being able to bring that skill set onto the board. And so director candidates that are able to demonstrate that add tremendous value to boards. I do think, though, there is a watch out from an overall nomination process perspective. And that is, if you bring someone onto a board that has specific expertise, which is needed, that's fine and that's valuable. But it's also really important for those directors to function as full directors and not just directors that are limited to that area of expertise. And that has a benefit for the full board, but it also serves the individual director well as well. Because you would not want someone to just be limited in terms of what that they can contribute, while everyone else participates as a full director. So what I mean by a full director is, in addition to their area of expertise, are they also asking the broader questions? Are they also participating in other discussions outside of their domain of expertise so that they are recognized and participating as full board directors? So while those areas such as digital, AI, disruption are really important in terms of bringing those skills onto the board, it is also important for those candidates to function as full directors, really like all other directors. And one other thing that I would add to that is that it highlights really for all directors to be focused on board education, because no one is an expert in everything, but the most successful directors are able to learn about areas that may be outside of their expertise so that they can participate in broader discussions and, again, function as full governance members across a wide range of topics.
You said that oversized boards can become burdened by bureaucracy and slow decision-making. How can directors tell when a board has crossed the line from healthy diversity of thought to a structure that is actually hindering effective governance?
Yeah, there are a few warning signs to pay attention to. One is if you see that meetings are actually running long, but without deeper insight. So you can have long board meetings that have discussions that go on and on and on, but in those extended discussions, if there are no additional insights that are being unearthed, that's a sign that the size may be too large, or the bureaucracy just may be out of control. And you may also see that decisions get diluted or may be delayed because you simply just may have too many voices in the room. Because you actually do want constructive conflict, you want debate, and you want dialogue, but you want it to be a phase. You don't want it to be a lifestyle. So you want to have periods when you're having board discussions where you have an exploration phase, but then you also have a decision phase and an execution phase. And so you don't want to live in just the discussion phase for an extended period of time that keeps you from being able to actually make decisions. Another warning sign is when boards are faced with a crisis or faced when they need to make quick decisions, but they find that they're unable to make quick decisions because they just have too many voices and too much of a bureaucracy, and decisions actually get slowed down. And it actually reveals a dysfunction when everyone knows that decisions need to be made in a timely fashion, but they're simply unable to do so because they just don't have the agility in order to make quick decisions. And then the final thing that I would say is that another telltale sign of when a board is too large is when you actually have uneven participation of board directors. So think about it. If you have a right-sized board, you tend to have even participation of board directors because there's really nowhere for the board directors to hide. And everyone needs to participate in just about every discussion. When you have a board that's too large, it's very possible to have some directors participate very frequently, but it's easy for other directors to kind of just sit back and not participate because they're just other voices that can carry the day, if you will. So if you see that uneven participation, that's another telltale sign that the board actually itself may be a bit too large.
That was Jeffery Perry. Next up, we will speak with Suzan Morno-Wade. Board materials tell a polished story, but is it the true one? Today, we're digging into the gap between what directors see on paper and what's actually happening inside the organization, especially when it comes to leadership. My next guest, Suzan Morno-Wade, Director and Compensation Committee Chair of Latham Pool Products Inc. and Director and Compensation and Leadership Development Chair of Veritiv Holdings, makes the case that boards are routinely surprised by succession gaps because they're evaluating talent through the wrong lens, and that the CHRO may be an underused key to closing that gap. So how do directors get past the presentation and find out whether they really have the leaders they'll need 3 to 5 years from now? Suzan, boards spend enormous time discussing CEO succession and talent, but much of what directors see comes through formal presentations and board materials. How can directors gain a more honest view of leadership strength and organizational health, and what role should the CHRO play in providing that perspective?
I am very fortunate to have sat in both seats, right? As a former CHRO and now a board member, comp committee chair. So I can look for patterns, and I see patterns as it relates to this topic. And for me, I agree with you. Boards do spend an enormous amount of time discussing succession, but I sometimes feel like it is through an old lens, the same sort of playbook. And what I mean is, succession's moving faster than any organization could ever absorb. I think I read and heard a stat that the CEO tenure is now on average about 4.7 years. Maybe you guys know that exactly, but I think it's about 4.7 years. So, while boards are routinely looking at financial, M&A, and operational analysis, and they're doing so with a lot of rigor, they don't always look at the human capital analysis in the same way. And so, second part to your question about the role of CHRO, I think the CHRO's role is really to help orchestrate what the board needs, to give them what I think is like this holistic view of readiness across the organization. Because the CHRO is an individual who has probably the most unique role in that they see the entire system from end to end. And so they can be quite impactful and useful in that discussion with the board around readiness, because they're doing so with data and evidence. So I think the CHRO is a trusted voice to the board at the end of the day in this process.
Companies often outgrow the leadership capabilities that got them to their current stage. What are the signs that a CEO is successfully evolving alongside the business? And what are the warning signs that leadership development is not keeping pace with the company's strategic demands?
For me, I think signs that a CEO is evolving with the business. Let's use, for example, if a CEO has transitioned from his or her operator role right? So they've had responsibility for a business unit or function. The sign that I'd be looking for is whether they're now thinking as an enterprise leader. They're now comfortable to shape the business versus running it. They're more comfortable letting their team make decisions rather than having all the decisions themselves. I also am passionate about learning, and I think a CEO has to exhibit high learning agility more in that role than ever before because less information comes to them. So they have to seek to learn, they have to seek perspective from others, and they have to engage outside as well as inside. I think a couple more things for me. I think one of the other things I'd be looking for, whether the CEO is prioritizing building a strong team is so that they can move faster. And so eliminating, removing underperformers. And then probably the last one for me that I look for is the relationship with the board. So do they see the value in the board? Are they trying to build a relationship with the board, one that's transparent and honest, and where they can leverage the skills of the board and use them as a sounding council or sounding board? And so, when I think about sort of warning signs, I guess it's really all of those in the reverse, right? Or the opposite. So, not able to build a high performing team, really puts the board off, becomes very insular in their thinking and their interactions, and, probably not even having good self-awareness that is necessary. And, for me, that's a bit, controversial at the end of the day is, CEO who's incapable of really leveraging those resources around them to be able to make strong decisions at the end of the day.
Many boards review succession plans regularly, yet leadership gaps still surprise them. What do directors most often miss when evaluating the executive pipeline, and how can boards determine whether they truly have the talent needed to evaluate strategy over the next 3 to 5 years?
Probably I'll start with honest conversation, Bill. I think that is one of the things that's missing. You've got management who may have one agenda. You may have the board that has a different, and they're not necessarily aligned. So the management may want to put names on a list. The board perhaps doesn't know those individuals or think that maybe the management team is developing the successors in the way that they should. And so that could contribute to that. So this honest conversation and assessment of people. And I also think we tend sometimes as humans to focus on what's needed today versus the capabilities that are needed tomorrow. And this is a conversation I'm very passionate about, and that we have to be thinking about talent that's needed to scale the business. We need leadership capacity that can grow with the business. And sometimes the business gets more complex as it grows. And so boards need to be able to determine whether they have the talent that can scale with a growing organization.
That was Suzan Morno-Wade. Next, we will talk with Amy Shenkan. The quarterly board meeting was built for a world that doesn't exist anymore. So why do so many boards still run on it? Today, we're asking whether that once a quarter cadence is now a governance risk in itself, quietly letting boards fall behind the pace of the businesses they oversee. My final guest, Amy Shenkan, Director of EverCommerce and RingCentral, has studied how private equity boards operate on a completely different rhythm and believes public boards can borrow from it without tipping into micromanagement. So where's the line between staying nimble in a world of AI disruption and cyber threats and just reacting to noise? Amy, you've argued that the traditional quarterly board meeting may no longer match the speed of today's business environment. What are the biggest governance risks created by a board cadence that was designed for a slower era? And where are boards most likely to fall behind management today?
To put a finer point on it, governance needs a new cadence. The board's job hasn't changed. The operating environment has definitely changed. Quarterly board meetings cannot be the primary operating system of governance today. I'd say this isn't a result just of AI, but I do think that AI may have presented a tipping point to a governance model that was already under strain. So 40 years ago, information moved more slowly and most industries moved more slowly. And quarterly oversight made sense because management had the time to gather information and analyze it and present it and do something about it. But today the world moves in weeks and sometimes days, and AI capabilities evolve monthly or weekly, and cyber threats emerge overnight, and geopolitical events can disrupt supply chains rapidly. Consumer changes are happening faster than traditional planning cycle, et cetera, et cetera. So management teams are living in that reality every day, while boards often see a carefully packaged snapshot every 3 months. So getting to your precise question, I think this creates several governance risks. One is something I'd call information asymmetry widening, which is that management inevitably becomes much closer to the operating reality than directors, and directors cannot as effectively discharge their oversight duties if that information asymmetry exists. The second risk is that the boards become or can become more reactive instead of proactive or even anticipatory. And so instead of helping to shape decisions, they end up reviewing decisions that have effectively already been made. And third, I'd say that strategy and risk can become disconnected. AI, cybersecurity, regulation, talent, geopolitics, these are no longer periodic agenda items. They're continuous strategic variables. And so I think part of the irony is the boards don't need more information. They need more continuous information and situational awareness. So the quarterly board meetings become decision forums rather than backward-looking information download sessions. Of course, this last point was and always will be good governance practice.
Private equity-backed companies often operate with far more frequent interaction between boards and management around value creation and transformation. Which elements of that model do you think public company boards can realistically adopt without crossing into micromanagement?
Yeah, great question. I think private equity has some structural advantages. The ownership is concentrated, the objectives and timeframes are more clear. Boards tend to be more engaged in execution and on a continuous basis. And I don't think that public companies want to operate that way, but there probably are a couple habits that are worth borrowing. And I'd say the first is cadence. Instead of interacting primarily every quarter, public company boards could add shorter touch points between meetings, focus conversations around a handful of strategic issues rather than full board books. I think the second thing to borrow from PE is clarity around value creation. So private equity company boards tend to know and focus on exactly which are the 5 or 6 initiatives that will determine enterprise value over the next couple of years. That's just how the theses are built and how the businesses are run. And public boards sometimes spend too much time reviewing yesterday's performance instead of spending time pressure testing tomorrow's assumptions. And PE boards also, I think, can have a greater sense of urgency given the defined timeline that encourages that urgency. So I'd say that's the second thing to borrow. And the third is working sessions instead of presentations. So some of the best board conversations happen without PowerPoint, and they involve debating scenarios and assumptions and trade-offs and not reading slides. And so I think the key distinction to remember, true for PE and true for public company boards, is the management owns the decisions, the boards own the oversight, and frequent interaction doesn't need to blur those roles if the conversations stay focused on assumptions, risk, capital allocation, strategic choices, rather than operational execution. And if also the conversations remain centered on the board, asking great questions and looking around corners and prompting management to think differently.
One of the tensions here is responsiveness versus stability in an environment shaped by AI disruption, geopolitical volatility, and cyber threats. How should boards know when a situation calls for rapid engagement and course correction versus resisting the urge to overreact to short-term noise?
I think, Bill, this might be one of the more or most important governance questions today. Boards need to balance a reactionary moves versus responsiveness to a changing environment, and even being anticipatory versus responsive. And we all need to get better at understanding the signal through all of the noise and helping management do the same, as it's often much more difficult for them given where they sit. And so I think about three categories. One is the noise. Noise is daily market fluctuation, social media cycles, competitor announcements. This noise rarely requires a board response or board engagement. Then there's signals, and signals are things like emerging trends and customer adoptions shift and technology inflection points and regulatory changes, and they deserve discussion and monitoring. And then I'd say the third category are events that fundamentally alter enterprise risk. And that could be a material AI breakthrough that affects the business model. It could be a major cyber incident. It could be supply chain disruption or capital market dislocation or a CEO succession issue. And those issues require immediate engagement from the board. And one thing, a board could do is agree in advance on these trigger points where that automatically warrant board involvement versus those that don't. And so instead of asking, should we call a meeting, you've already answered the question before a situation arises. And I think the idea here would be that creates discipline without creating reactionary moves. And I'd say good governance really is not about reacting faster. It's really about knowing which events deserve a reaction at all. And this kind of framing might help with those conversations.
Okay, everybody. Well, thank you so much to Amy Shenkan, Suzan Morno-Wade, and Jeffery Perry. And thank you for joining us for this episode of Executive Session. Please look out for our next episode. And if you enjoyed this episode, make sure to share it with your friends and colleagues and let them know they can look for it on the Directors and Boards website. Also, make sure to check out directorsandboards.com, where you can get all the articles from our magazine, as well as so much more. You might also be interested in our weekly newsletter, which you can subscribe to at our website. And when you visit the site, make sure to check out all the back episodes of Executive Session, which are also available wherever you get podcasts. And for the videocast version of the show, as well as individual interview segments, you can check out the Directors and Boards YouTube channel. One last thing, the agenda for the Character of the Corporation 2026, being held November 12th in New York City, is available at the Directors and Boards website. Check it out today and get more details about the event. So once again, I'm your host, Bill Hayes, and until next time, consider this executive session closed.